calling the meeting to order. Looks okay. We'll go right straight to the first item, budget planning workshop number 2. Study session on financial issues. Will be talking with us. Come on over here, Will, and let's start with what you have to say to us. There we are.
The first part of the study session that we wanted to look at this morning was to revisit GASB 45 and look a little bit historically at how GASB 45 has affected the library, going back to 2008 when it was implemented and kind of where we're at right now with it, and then take a look at where GASB 45 is taking the library in the future and look into some policy adoption around that. If you flip to, let's see, what page is this? It's page 1 of the agenda item. GASB 45 was, I'll be brief on history because I think we've talked about it so much, but GASB 45 was implemented back in 2008, and it was a requirement of all government agencies to evaluate what the potential liability is of the promise of other post-employment benefits for your existing staff. So it's not a liability of future hires or what it's going to cost you to maintain employment basis in the future. It's the cost of the promise you have made to your existing staff, not future hires. And so in the library situation, the promise that you have made to your existing staff is retiree health care. And in 2008, you were required to have an actuarial study performed. Actually, it was required to be performed before 2008 because it was adopted in 2008. So in late 2006, you had an actuarial study done in order to determine what the cost of providing retiree health care was to your existing workforce. At that time, the study was based on your existing workforce, their ages, their salaries, and the retirement promise that was in effect back in 2006. Rolling forward several years, at that time, your liability to your existing workforce was projected to be roughly $14 million. And that liability was not required to be paid up front, but the provision of GASB 45 requires you to recognize that $14 million liability over no less than 30 years. Back in 2008, when it was required to be implemented for all government agencies, basically what every government agency was doing was figuring out what is that total liability, and then continuing to just pay for retiree healthcare benefits as they were incurred. I think at that time, and still even now, some government agencies are sort of sitting back, waiting to see what other people are doing to fund this. But there is a lot of pressure right now to evaluate why you're not fully funding the annual obligation if you're not prepaying into it. When the library implemented GASB 45 in 2008, the pay-as-you-go cost for existing retirees was right around $420,000 a year. And so even though your liability was roughly $14 million, and when you looked at having to pay that over 30 years, it would cost you about $1.4 million a year, the library was just paying for the hard cost of the existing retirees, which was about $422,000. If you want to flip to, let's see, it's document 1.2.1.2, there is a trend analysis in your agenda packet. I'll wait till everybody gets there. Everyone find that page? So I'm talking about the first column there, the 6/30/2008 figure. Since 2008, the library has continued to only pay for the actual hard cost, the pay-as-you-go cost of retiree healthcare benefits, and that's that line right there in the middle of the page in bracketed figures. You can see that that amount is escalating each year. It's gone from roughly $422,000 in 2008 up to $532,000 in 2012. That increase is the result of basically two things. One, the increased cost of providing healthcare benefits, which is hitting every agency, both public and private. And two, that you've had an increased number of retirees on that system since 2008. Since 2008, the library's also gone through a series of renegotiating the cost of healthcare benefits, benchmarking to different healthcare plans, and negotiating new entry-level retiree healthcare benefits, which, well, yes, trying to. If you look across at the top numbers there, each year, the total unfunded actuarial liability, that's the total unfunded liability based on the actuarial study that was performed. In 2008 and 9, you'll see that that actuarial liability is actually the same. Your actuarial study is only required to be performed once every 2 years, unless you have a material change in operations around your healthcare benefits. In 2010, you'll see that there's a significant bump in the unfunded actuarial liability. It jumps from 14 million to 19 million. In that year, the library offered some early incentives around retirement. And between the actuarial studies, there was also a significant increase in the cost of healthcare benefits nationwide, not just for the library. And so when that actuarial study was updated, it caused a significant increase in the unfunded liability, almost $5 million. Between then and 2011, through several initiatives, primarily benchmarking, revisiting the healthcare benefit plans that were offered, the library had a new actuarial study performed in 2010, which lowered the unfunded liability from 19 million to 13 million, a significant decrease. Kaiser benchmarking, I believe, came into effect in December of 2011. Is that right, Sandy? Yes.
Patrick said yes.
Okay. The interesting thing about GASB 45 and this actuarial study is that it's sort of counterintuitive. You would think that, like the early retirement incentives, for example, when you look at that significant bump in 2010, you would think, well, if we're retiring people sooner, that and not necessarily hiring a lot of new people, that it might change that number. But the actuarial study and the factors that go into it, and I don't perform it, there's a third-party actuary that performs it. Early incentive retirement packages actually drastically increase your unfunded liability because you've no longer smoothed the cost of that person over time. You've retired them sooner. We've also included a best practices document in here as well. If I could find what page it's on.
1.2.1.3 is the next page.
And hindsight's 20/20, but early retirement incentives are actually to your detriment when trying to smooth out and cover this liability over time. fast forwarding to where we are right now, the library is still on pay-as-you-go and has accrued roughly a $5 million unfunded liability at this point. That unfunded liability takes into account these sort of peaks and valleys in the total liability across the top of this document that you're seeing. But right now, the library is recognizing that liability over 30 years, the maximum amount allowable. There's no longer amortization period that the library could choose to fund the liability over. The only way to manage the liability at this point is to either A, start funding it, B, continue to look at the retirement incentives that you offer to new employment, or C, a combination of both. And I think it's a discussion point for the commission to get well documented, because at this point, agencies are starting to fund the liability. Agencies are documenting why or why they can't fund the liability. And one of the best practices at this point that every agency is being held to is to document their decision-making around why they're on pay-as-they-go, why they can't fund it, how they are going to fund it, and what decisions they're making around closing the gap on that liability. I think one of the things, and we've talked about it for several years at commission meetings, is that this liability, it's not going to go away. It is going to ebb and flow, and it can be managed through monetary decisions, through funding, through collaborative efforts around the retirement benefits that are offered to make the program sustainable. But as I've shared with the commission before, I think it's really important for you as governors of the organization to have it well documented as to what you're funding, why you can't fund, and what the long-term prospect of this liability is.
And this shows up on our balance sheet, right?
It does, yes. So if you, that year OPEB liability, the last number there, 4.8 million, that is your liability as of June 30, 12, which will probably grow by another 800,000 to 900,000 for 2013, because you are still currently on pay-as-you-go.
And so we have does this affect our fund balance policy in terms of calculating how much we have in there? Like we have a goal of 20% of an operating budget and a minimum of 12. Does this number get taken into account?
No, it does not.
Okay.
So right now, this number, as it grows, is basically just eating up your unrestricted fund balance, which I think, if I recall back to the last commission meeting when we presented the June 30, 12 financials, I believe it was within 4 years, eating it up at a rate of 800,000 to 900,000 a year. Within 4 years, your unrestricted fund balance would essentially be zero. On paper, yes. Because remember this, I mean, we're not, to date, this liability has not been funded with cash.
Right. And is there, our packet includes different ways to structure, either set up a irrevocable trust or
Right.
set up a committed fund balance?
I think, in my opinion, I think you have to continue looking at it from a two-pronged approach. On one side, you have to continue to monitor the level of benefit that is offered, continue to monitor the packages that are offered to new employees, and your benchmarking and management from the cost side. And you've got to start managing the monetary side, either through committed fund balance, either through funding it into a trust. It's going to have to be two-sided, because there's no way that you couldn't, I mean, if you look at your current budgets and operations, there isn't $800,000 or $900,000 a year to start throwing at this. You're going to have to manage it from both sides. And I think if you look at just the swing from 2009, 10, and 11, and you look at that total unfunded actuarial liability going from 14 million at inception and jumping to 19 million, and that jump was, like I said, twofold. One, there were significant costs of health benefits that were increasing at that point in time. And two, the early incentive retirement packages that were offered caused a huge spike. Then you looked at benchmarking, healthcare costs, healthcare packages, and you also slowed down your hiring during that time period too, which caused a significant decrease without funding anything. So, I mean, I think if you continue to look at both sides of it, that you will be able to manage it, but it's gonna take both sides.
And am I correct in thinking that as long as that it is easier to predict and fund when the healthcare benefit is a set amount rather than tied to a percentage because you don't have control over the way the healthcare industry is gonna?
That's correct.
Okay.
And am I also hearing that as we re-staff, this will increase the liability?
As you restaff, it will increase the liability, yes.
Okay.
So moving money to a committed fund, but specific account, in, 500,000 or whatever the amount we do, the bottom line impact to the total net assets is really, there's no impact, right? We're just really
Correct.
moving
You're
it.
just moving it. Like, the committed fund balance will not pay down the liability. It won't pay down until you move it into trust.
Okay.
But am I correct in understanding what we've talked about, Will, in that you really feel that by being clear about the reasons that the library cannot pay down the liability at the rate of $800,000
Yes.
a year, and showing some attempt to earmark some money plus continuing pay-as-you-go are probably the show good faith effort?
Right, I think
And
from
are the most we can
from
do.
your due diligence and governance perspective, making sure that you're documenting your understanding of the steps you have taken to manage healthcare costs, to address new hire packages and how that affects your actuarial study, and then monetarily evaluating it in your budget, what you can allow yourself to commit, why you haven't established a trust fund for it yet. And one of your reasons for not having established a trust fund yet may be because you're still reviewing your new hire packages, you're benchmarking your healthcare standards, and you're determining what the best trust fund is to place your money in. In the meantime, the committed fund balance, if you were to start committing money through the budget process for this each year, the commitment is at the commission level, right? So you could hold that commitment there for OPEB until you feel like you've arrived at a place where your OPEB policies are the best for the library and they are sustainable for the library, and you're ready to commit that money to trust. Because once you commit it to trust, it's not coming back. That's not to say that if you committed it to trust and 3 to 5 years from now, you really got this program to be sustainable and manageable for the library, and that trust was overfunded at that point, it would basically then adjust your annual commitment. I mean, it's not, this liability is going to ebb and flow as the library adopts new policy and operates throughout the years.
So the due diligence issue aside, on a very practical level, if we continue to do pay-as-we-go, in 20 years, it's going to suck up our entire budget?
Well, in 20 years, you won't be able to pay as you go. I mean, in 20 years, you can see, let me go back to this. In 20 years, you will be at, your cost of retiree health benefits, hypothetically, would be the annual cost that you're not paying right now. Your existing staff would all be retired.
Right.
And you'd be paying 1.3 million on pay as you go.
Every year.
Every year. It wouldn't
Right.
be, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
Under current
Right.
revenues.
Right.
What the actuarial study, and I feel like I'm speaking in his place because he's not here, but what the actuarial study attempts to do is determine if everybody who is working in the library was retired all at once, what would the annual cost of that benefit be?
Right.
And right now your annual cost is 1.3 million, of which 532,000 of it is retired.
And that, I assume the actuarial study also takes into account that certain of our aging current retirees won't still be on the program due to
Correct.
death, and so it
takes
figures
in-
out,
It takes into account, rate of return, age, increased cost of payroll, increased cost of healthcare benefits. I mean, there's a number of actuarial factors that are in there.
okay.
Okay. Any other questions from any of the other commissioners at this point?
How do the actuaries develop their assumptions?
I don't know that I should speak on behalf of the actuary, just because I'm not the one performing the actuarial study, but if you read the report, he uses interest rates of return that are modest over time. I mean, we had this discussion at the commission meeting too. There is no crystal ball, and this number is not exact, but they've tried to build a model that is within a reasonable range of what it will be costing you. There's, modest increases for payroll, modest increases for expected increases in healthcare costs. But again, it definitely is an estimate.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one other.
Well, one more thing on the actuarial study too. I think while all of those factors, interest rate of return and average retirement age and expected healthcare costs are all estimates, don't forget that it's also being updated every 2 years, and those estimates are being revisited every 2 years as well. So it's not just in 2008 they use some figures that they think are going to exist 30 years from now.
So do I gather that we will have another actuarial study this year?
Correct.
Julia?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to turn to the best practices document you gave us, and I don't know that you will have an answer to this, but if you know, on page 2 of that best practices, paragraph 6 talks about effective communication for educating stakeholders. Are you familiar with what other government agencies are doing?
I think a number of government agencies are still on pay-as-you-go, starting to commit fund balance. There were it wasn't a huge percentage of government agencies, but there were some state and county and city government, larger government agencies who, at the onset of GASB 45, predicted it coming and started bond issuances in advance, so that they actually basically were funding their debt to begin with through bond issuances. But the majority of government agencies are still on pay-as-you-go with some adaptation of increasing their committed fund balance for it.
And is this the issue that arose a couple of years ago with the county when they issued a bond and also went to a straight?
I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I have one. You said that there are different prongs in an approach, and one of them was efficiently stating why we aren't funding and so forth. What form does that take? Is that part of the policy?
That's part of the policy in the annual resolution.
Okay. Shall we move on to discussing the policy and are there any other questions for Will at this point? Nope. Okay.
You want to stay there?
You wanna-
Oh, yeah, stay.
He'll stay here, but I just thought at this stage, okay. Okay, any thoughts about the policy? Any questions?
I want to make sure the 5-year trend analysis, does that make sense to everybody, why those numbers are moving so drastically? And that it's multiple things that have been affected that change those each year. It's not just one decision.
Should our goal be to try to get to a point where we are at least moving, so this year the proposal is 500,000, but in terms of our goal, should it be to where we're trying to move that annually, that increase in the liability into this committed funds to get to that point, so at least we're not increasing it each year?
Well, I think if you are benchmarking, you're going to be chasing yourself a bit. If you are benchmarking to a particular healthcare plan, externally, you're always subject to whatever is happening to the cost of that healthcare plan, right? So if you were to just stick at benchmarking to one particular healthcare plan, every 2 years when the actuarial study is performed, you're subject to the risk of increased healthcare costs. While the actuarial study builds that in, to Mary Evelyn's point, if they're not using the right rate, your liability might bump significantly in 6 years because they've underestimated that 6 years from now, the costs are going to go up 20%, not 10% in the model. Whereas if you're benchmarking to a specific dollar amount that you're providing for, you might not have as much future risk of increase. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, not that 500,000 doesn't sound like a reasonable amount, but kind of, it feels like we just sort of pulled a number and said, well,
Sure.
500,000. And I'm trying to see, is there something to tie that to that, is what we should be, whether we can afford it or not this year, but, what's kind of the structural logic of saying this is the amount we should be earmarking
Right. So
each year?
I think in looking at that amount, going back to the due diligence piece of it, what I would say is when you look at your budget and you look at, after we cover the basic operations of the library, the commission makes some decisions about where the other piece of that budget is spent, and so, or what it's reserved for. And is it increased staffing? Is it capital improvement? Is it funding OPEB? Is it endowing money? I think those are the decisions that the commission has to make. And so $500,000 was arrived at through the budget process. I don't know that, I think it's up to you to discuss if there is $500,000 in the budget, is OPEB where it should go? And I think that's the piece, the due diligence piece.
But in this case, we're not funding it out of our operating budget. We are funding it out of the reserve fund. We're just committing the money
Correct.
to that. So unless we haven't had extra money in our operating budget for some time now. So assuming, I guess, following up on Susan's question, part of what, should our policy reflect a minimum percentage of our increased liability that we aim to set aside each year?
Or could.
I think you have to, based on the fact that you're running razor thin every year, I think it's more a matter of how much of your unrestricted fund balance are you willing to commit?
Well, obviously, at some point, if we don't continue doing it, we're going to spend all of it on pay-as-you-go.
Right.
So I guess in terms of drafting a policy, is it a recommendation that the policy contains some actual goal or set amount rather than just saying we're going to do something more stable?
I see what you're saying. A goal of.
So we know that it's we're adding how much this year?
You'll add approximately 800 to 900,000.
Okay, so we add 800,000 this year, and obviously, ideally, we'd put the whole 800,000 aside, but should a policy include something like no less than 10% of additional liability? Or, how specific in drafting policies would you recommend we get?
I don't think
Because
we're,
it's-
from our conversation, Will, I don't get the sense that we're in a place where we're able to start naming
I
numbers.
was just gonna say, I don't think you are either. I think that for now, because the budget is so tight and you're using reserves, if you move forward with committing any portion of your fund balance, you're basically using reserves to do this. I think that this isn't necessarily, I don't know that I would take it as a long-term policy. I think you need to evaluate it every budget process, what you're willing to commit. And remember that the committed fund balance is committed by the commission.
Right.
If you needed to use that committed fund, let's say, I don't know, in 4 years, we hit another really down economy or something drastic happens to the budget, that committed fund balance could be uncommitted by the commission and used to fund pay-as-you-go. But I think that you're in a situation where there isn't excess revenue to fund this into trust, but you could make each year your best effort to commit as much as reasonably possible. I don't know that you're ready for a long-term funding policy yet.
Well, I'm just wondering if we want to craft a policy that directs not just this commission, but future commissions when money starts to come back in, that this is the priority.
Actually, I think that well, you don't say it's the priority because that would be a decision that would be made by the commission at that point.
Well, but
But
that-
on
this is
page 1 of the draft policy, starting on line 20, it outlines what the commission will do or the library will do. We could change that to library commission. Is A, to have the actuarial study done every 2 years to ensure that it's done in a way that funds the long-term cost. Then the third thing, which we continue to do, which is, as Will said, you have to continue to work at it in various ways, would be to carefully evaluate and design benefits to ensure that they're stable, but also that they create stability in your retiree health. And then choose a funding approach that is appropriate to both the library's circumstances and long-term sustainability, carefully evaluating options annually as part of the budget development process. And you're going to have to continue to adopt that annual resolution. So every year at this time, it makes sense that the commission looks seriously at what it's in a position to do. I think,
I would say with as tight as your budget is, and probably for the foreseeable future will continue to be, we know it takes 18 months or so before property tax revenues start to turn into increased revenues for the library. If I were you, I wouldn't commit myself to a long-term funding policy yet. The way that Sandy has drafted the policy is it's a policy that you're adopting to take some steps annually to evaluate OPEB, some standards around the actuarial study, revisiting the benefits, and taking that multifaceted approach to managing it, and committing $500,000 this year without adopting a policy to commit $500 every year.
Right.
But that your policy is you will revisit this annually with these multifaceted approaches.
I guess I have a concern that while this policy does suggest we revisit it annually, and it might cover our legal due diligence requirements, it doesn't necessarily say we're not going to do pay-as-we-go. It doesn't say we think that's a bad idea. It's a little broader or more open than I guess I'm comfortable with given, and I would like to see maybe that, I understand we're not ready to commit to a long-term funding plan at this point, but I would like to see somewhere a timeline that suggests when we're, how often we're going to review a long-term funding plan. What are the markers for when we're ready to do that, rather than just leaving it open to, well,
Sure.
We'll look at it every year
So
and
if there
see
was-
what we think.
If there was language in there whereby you recognize that pay-as-you-go is not sustainable,
Yes.
okay?
And that each year we would look at all of these things. I think these are all good and appropriate things to put in the policy, but I would like to add in there, we also look at whether it's time to do a long-term funding plan.
Helena, you had,
I just had a question. In the proposed resolution, it says it's actuarially defined contribution, ADC. Is that the same as the
It is.
annual required contribution?
They just changed the language. So
So-
it is actuarially, it's ADC now,
Okay,
which is new language for this year.
okay.
Same thing though.
Okay, and the figure is different than what's on your charts.
Which
It's-
page are you on?
Well, in the resolution, it's 1.275, 1,275,000, and in the chart, it's 1,342,000.
Is that from the newest?
I think I got it from the newest study.
Yeah.
The newest study,
The most recent actuarial study.
which was done in,
It's dated, it was done and dated, and you accepted it last July, I believe.
There was a new study that was performed after, Kaiser was December 2011. Then there was a new study that was performed after the Kaiser study, which was not used for the financial statement audit because it wasn't in effect at the beginning of the fiscal year. So you have a new study sitting there already.
okay, a little confusing, but, so you don't think it's a good idea to say that our goal would be to get to a place where we can set aside money to meet the ADC? You don't think that would be a good policy?
I think that is, your goal is to.
But it
fully
doesn't
fund
say
the
that in
ADC.
our resolution, and I had heard you kind of say something different. But it might be a good thing to put into the policy that is our goal, is to meet the ADC
At some point.
at some point in the future, that this year we're going to set aside $500,000, but our goal over the long term is to get to a place where we can meet the ADC and start. Sandy, could that, I don't know what the rest of the commission thinks, but it seems
what
like
is-
that would be a simple thing to add into the resolution.
I
that that's
don't
just a
object to
goal.
it, but what is the point of that?
Just to, anybody who reads the resolution can see that that's our long-term plan, is to try to meet that obligation.
And I also think that it helps with the educational component because this policy is public and there are people who don't understand when we talk about this liability, what we're talking about.
That might be another thing to put into it, that, you have up here, whereas we currently offer this retiree health benefit, and we're committed to covering that benefit for our current employees. And through this policy, that's what we're trying to do.
So a philosophical
Yes.
statement.
I don't know how everybody else
Yeah,
feels.
I guess that's the only thing I'm concerned about. As a philosophical statement, that's nice, that is what we want to do. I just want to be very careful about first committing any future commissions to having to do this. If we said anything more specific than a philosophical position, what are we imposing on people who come after us and they may not be able to deliver it?
Well, you can say you have a goal. It's a good thing to have a goal.
I think it's important for all of our stakeholders to understand that this is something that when we are evaluating, where we put our funds, that we, this has to be not just the pay-as-you-go piece, but, this additional funding for the future obligation has to be on the table when we're evaluating everything else. And I think this is really the first year that the commission has done that, right? In
Yeah,
the
I
past,
agree.
we've not.
well, the other thing I think I need to mention, it's obvious, is that we can't keep doing $500,000 a year from the fund balance forever. That's finite.
Yeah.
So there is a time
Yeah.
limit to when we can get to whatever the next step might be.
Well, in response to your questions, I think that there could be a whereas somewhere around line 11 with that recognizes that the benefit must be sustainable and affordable, and then have a whereas that you want to, something to the effect that you're committed to funding retirement, post-retirement benefits as, we've currently agreed to, something like that. I can't come up with elegant language at the moment. But put that in after it must be sustainable and affordable, which is essentially saying that, you're committed to making sure that we're able to support it for the employees, current employees. And then it seems to me if you want something more concrete in the resolution, it could be somewhere in one of the be it further resolved. It could almost just be a tweak in the wording of that last where be it further resolved on line 26, if you want to make it more definitive. I just don't know. My concern would be that until you have more money and the money is at sustainable levels to even operate, you're not in a position to know when you can commit.
Absolutely.
I would agree with that. I guess I was looking more at the policy language rather than the actual resolution. And I would like to see something in the policy that gives future commissions the direction we were wanting to head. Then if they want to change the policy, I guess, of course they can. But I think we want to clearly explain what we're trying to accomplish with this policy.
Well, I guess in my mind, this does, although it doesn't say we will do X on Y date. So we could add something that says we will do X on Y date.
Well, I like the suggestion that, and I actually have the same language right here, that the commission does not consider pay-as-you-go a sustainable option. And just to make sure that it's clear, we're heading away from that, even if we can't do it every year to the full amount, that we just put in that that's the goal. I mean, I think putting a goal in without locking in the date we have to do it is and I just would like to see it a little bit plainer language of what our goal is. I mean, I like all of the to achieve this goal, to achieve the goals in this policy. I think all of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things are well worded and excellent and necessary. I would just like to see the goal we're achieving to be a little more clearly stated. Maybe I'm being fussy.
So as part of your policy, would you then want it to state that annually the commission recognizes that pay-as-you-go is not sustainable? Annually, the commission will...
Well, not the commission's goal is to annually fund the, what do they call it now, ADC. I mean, just say
so
that's the
annually
goal.
the commission will maximize its commitment of funds to OPEB.
Right.
I mean, is that, without putting a monetary amount in there?
Without
Well,
putting, I mean, I would be satisfied with just saying the goal is to, the goal is to fully fund the ADC each year, recognizing that this may not be possible each and every year. Here's how we're going to approach it.
Did you have it under number 4? Because it would most logically be put in there as probably a clause that just says,
Okay.
further defines what sustainability is. Because it says you're carefully evaluating options and adopting an annual resolution. Something with the goal of
Right, but
fully funding
with the goal of fully funding,
the
right,
ADC.
right.
The other thing that I don't see in a survey of this is what you mentioned before about somewhere stating why we can't fund it now. You mentioned-
Actually, there's an attempt to do that.
Oh, where the current financial resources do not support.
Right,
Okay. That's
fully
good.
funding the OPEB liability or the annual defined contribution or whatever.
ADC or OPEB?
The ADC for the, you can make it alphabet soup, ADC of the OPEB.
Are there any other comments from the commission? My understanding is then we vote on this at some point
Next time.
next time, so.
So
I know.
what I'm hearing from you all is that you want number 4 to be more explicit that the goal is to fully fund the ADC.
And somewhere in there to say we recognize that pay-as-you-go is not sustainable.
And then in the
Going back to the ADC for just to that one statement, the goal is to fully fund the ADC. Do you want to add right before that anything about management of the ADC? That you're not, I mean, I think
Oh, yeah.
being
Well,
that it's a two-pronged approach, I don't know that you want to make a statement that the goal is just to fully fund your ADC.
Well, and number 3 here says carefully evaluate and design benefits to ensure that they are stable. And maybe want to say stable and affordable over the long term, or stable and sustainable.
Maybe stable and as a way to manage the ADC somehow for that. in there.
Just to manage the,
To manage the ADC.
Any other further comments from?
wait,
Go ahead.
I want to, if you don't mind.
I'm fine.
So those would be the changes in the policy, and then the changes in the, for the resolution, you'd like to be clear on line 14 that we're not able to fully fund the annual defined contribution and the current OPEB liability. And then, do you want something about, in here about allocating available funds? Let's see, down in the last B, further resolved, that's explicit about, a little more explicit about the ADC, or do you think funding the ADC over time? Or is it okay?
Didn't you want a statement in here that the library recognizes that pay-as-you-go is not sustainable?
Yeah, I was thinking of that going into the policy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it needs to be in the resolution. We can
Okay.
put it in the resolution too if
Okay.
people think it would be helpful in educating and outreach and explaining what we're doing and due diligence.
And I think that I'm sorry, and the commitment to funding the current employees' health care, I think would go a long way to helping people understand the importance of this obligation.
Paul?
As a public document, does the public see both the policy and the resolution? Do they go together? So I don't know if we have to restate everything in the policy and the resolution necessarily.
You agree? I agree. I can tell by you.
Okay.
I don't know why I'm a lawyer, but I like fewer words. I don't understand that.
Further comments from the commission? Are there any comments from the public on this agenda item? Yes. Please stand and use the mic.
Stand and use the mic.
Use the mic because we're...
Roger Pearson, Santa Rosa. One question I have, it's probably for the auditor, but when people reach 65, retirees, and go on to Medicare, is there a significant reduction in liability?
The Medicare component is actually already built into the actuarial study.
Okay.
And just in response, one of the things that we had hoped to negotiate would be a change so that when a retiree hits Medicare, they go off of the library's healthcare plan. But that has to be negotiated.
Okay.
So we have not been able to negotiate that to this point.
What I was wondering or thinking out loud was, whereas they encouraged early retirement at one point, in fact, is there any benefit to encouraging people to stay on until they reach 65?
Right now.
It seems to me if you had a lot of people who retired at 50 and then, or 55 for 10, 15 years, were getting the full, coverage rather than the Medicare supplement, that would be a significant increase in liability.
Which is why you see that significant increase, I believe it's in the 2009 year, where it jumps from 14 million to 19
Okay.
million because early retirement was encouraged.
So that's what I'm saying, perhaps, I don't know if this is the place for the public to suggest it, but they look into encouraging people to stay longer.
Well, I think that people are staying longer, Roger. That's really not our issue. Right now, the agreement, our MOU, we continue to pay healthcare costs and Medicare costs, as you would know. And so there's no reduction in the library's cost when somebody goes on Medicare. We're trying to negotiate that now.
Oh, okay. So there could be, should be.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, good job.
Has Jeff Kushuk visited your commission meeting? I feel a little remiss speaking about the details of the actuarial study on his behalf because it's not my study, but.
Maybe we should
Maybe it's
invite
time
him
for
to a
him to
meeting
come.
sometime. Maybe since it's time to have another one almost done.
I'm going to note that down.
Yeah, we'll put it in the follow-up.
Okay. Are we done, ready to move on?
So I think I have my marching orders about the changes to the policy and the resolution for the next meeting.
Okay.
And assuming that you do want to leave the 500,000 as committed fund balance, which is in the next section.
Okay, on to the library fund balance policy and allocation. Is there any report from staff about this?
Well, we have provided a fact sheet for you, the current policy. There's something missing here. There were more documents. I'll try to recreate what I think was in the cover sheet. Oh, I don't have it. That's why I don't. Thank you. We wanted to make sure that you understood the GASB 54 statement and the current fund balance policy, understand the prior method or lack thereof for allocating the fund balance, and agree on the proposed allocation for the budget for this year. We redid the policy in 2010 to comply with GASB 54, which was new at that time. Prior to this year, you have implicitly okayed the allocation of the fund balance. But we've not had what I would call a appropriate method for deciding what should be allocated in each category. So that what I think this year we want to do is make sure that you're aware of what's allocated for each of the categories, that you have the background to understand the allocation, you understand why we were recommending that, and that we also routinely subtract the expenditures from that category at the end of the year, which has not been done up to now. In other words, what happened was when we first went to this policy, we set up a little allocation formula just to get started, and that we never moved from that formula to a reasonable, rational, explainable method for allocating to each category. Nor did we, for instance, in the self-check line, if we spent money on self-check, we didn't subtract that from the line that was set aside for that purpose. So those are some things that we now are doing and need to start doing. And then we need to do some more work to support a more rational allocation process. And the first one, which is also included in the revision of Focus and Finish, is to come up with a schedule of anticipated life cycles and amortized costs for the replacement of capital assets, so that that is a rational, explainable number that we are funding at an appropriate level and that we have a plan to replace trucks, and we have a plan to replace servers and all of that. And then we also, that would be in the short term. This next year, we need to come up with that allocation process. And then in the long term, we need to come up with a capital improvements plan that would then be reflected in what's allocated for capital improvements. So those are the items that are recommended. I don't know if that makes, so that what you've got in the preliminary budget on the spreadsheet is a first step toward a more rational process of allocating the money to the branch improvement project, self-check project, capital asset maintenance fund. It's still not where it needs to be, but I'd say we've taken a first step toward trying to come up with some numbers so that you can see under committed fund balance for right now, what you'd be approving with the budget is $425,000 for the branch improvement project, which is almost a placeholder at this point because we don't have the money to really do major improvements to additional branches. There is money in there for self-check projects because we want to try to expand self-check at least partially to the 3 busiest branches that don't have it. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Then there's the $500,000 for post-employment benefits, OPEB funding. There's the policy-defined amounts for the emergency reserves and counter-cyclical. Then the capital asset maintenance fund is still under assigned for what reason and not under committed?
It could be under committed.
Yeah. And then the others are?
The capital asset maintenance fund, I guess, can we touch on that for just
Yeah.
a second? Because it is different than the branch improvement project or the self-check project. I think for a couple of years now, since GASB 54 came out, we've been talking about the need for some capital asset replacement study to be done for the library, and not some elaborate external study, but just some internal study about kind of carving out the major assets of the library. You've got identifiable stuff like vehicles, some larger purchases around vehicles and IT, where you could, on a specific asset identification basis, kind of time out when you're going to need to replace those things. And then with your smaller items, do sort of a trend analysis of what the expected replacement is based on cost of those assets. And determine a methodology whereby each year you're putting money aside for your capital asset replacement based on either those large purchases or your historical trend analysis of smaller purchases. And so that's, I think, where you need to get to with that capital asset replacement fund. But at this point, the analysis has not yet been performed.
Is there a reason that it's gone from 296 to 750 in
What's it? I'm sorry.
the capital asset management maintenance fund?
Because that's a placeholder number.
It's a placeholder.
And I don't know why it was reduced to 296 in the previous year.
But it's a significant increase. You're seeing.
Right, and we have 6 trucks and we have, an integrated library system that's 8 years old. We have a lot of things that we need to be planning to replace.
Does that 750 include what we heard about last time, the open source, potentially buying into the open source?
You mean getting a new integrated library system?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that 750 includes that amount?
Yeah, that would be a new integrated library system. We should, over the life of an integrated library system, be putting away money to replace it. And the same thing with our trucks.
Right.
We should be making sure we have adequate money so that we don't have to take it out of our annual operating budget.
Right.
So it's having the savings account to cover it.
Right, no, I understand.
Any idea how long it'll take for that study?
Well, that will depend on the budget and finance staff, but it's on the focus and finish, and I think I'd have to look, we can look at it
Right, okay,
there
we can get
to
it
see
there.
when the deadline was to try to get it done.
So were we purchasing software have we purchased that?
The purchase is in process. I looked at the purchase order before I went and asked for some changes to be made, and so it should be signed this week and go out this week.
I have some basic question. What, in this chart, which is very good, but I didn't understand the difference between the use of the fund balance contribution to operating expenditures and then just use of fund balance contribution to. Operating expenses, I understand. This is what we're going to use out of the fund balance to keep us going this year?
Are you looking up at the top?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
yellow lines at the top.
I'm looking under expenditures.
The top half?
Yes.
Okay, the use of fund balance and contribution to fund balance for capital expenditures are the things we're saying consciously, these are the things that we would spend that would consciously be capital items that we're paying for, not from operating income, but from the fund balance.
Right.
And then the second one is saying, yes, we understand that right now our budget uses $755,000 of fund balance to fund operating costs.
And would that then be our policy that we adopt every year that says within 18 months, we're going to have a plan to repay that 750,000?
Right, if we end up with a budget that has 750,000 and we don't bring it down and we don't save enough money to counteract that, yes, then we have to repay it.
Okay. So
Okay.
I guess part of my question is, since we've been using, well, not every year, but since 2008, 2009, we have used some of the reserves for operating budget.
Right.
Have we repaid all of
Yes,
that?
we have.
Out of our
Because-
operating budget?
No, it doesn't have to come from the operating budget. It can come from the reserves. So essentially what we've done is reallocated reserves to that amount so that we've repaid it each year.
We're just reducing our reserves? then?
Yes, exactly.
And is that, I mean, I guess that was not my understanding of what we were meant to be doing when we adopted the policy. So I guess maybe we need the policy to be more clear that we either can or cannot use reserves for this, because I feel like a little bit of it is just kind of a shell game. We're just moving money from one bucket to the other and saying, okay, we've paid it back, but the reality is we haven't.
Well, I guess
back.
that's part of the unfortunate part of not having explicit discussions about the reserves.
Right.
Each year, the fund balance, when we have the budget discussion, is to simply say, yes, we're going to simply repay from the reserves, or no, we're not, we're going to take it out of the operating fund.
The committed fund balance area, not to use, shell game sounds so derogatory.
No, I don't mean that. I just mean,
The committed fund balance area of your budget is the area that you as a group collectively decide to commit each
Right.
year. So if you decided to, for example, reduce your commitment for self-check in order to repay your stabilization fund, you are allowed to do that, but I think the fact, it just needs to be a little more explicit.
right. And the language of our policy is that it will be restored, and I guess I was misinterpreting the word restored as outside funding coming in to bring everybody up
No.
to where it used to be. So that was
The
maybe-
practice has been to simply reallocate the money so that those are fully funded. And I'm looking right now at the policy. See it on page 3 of the policy, line 17 through 24 are the sections on the restoration. And essentially what's supposed to happen is that the director is supposed to present a plan to the commission for restoring. So it'd be at that point where you decide whether you want to take money out of your operating budget and restore it, or whether you want to reallocate it.
Did we have a plan presented to us for the money?
No,
we
you
spent?
haven't, and the practice has been, what I'm saying is, we need to make sure that at this meeting every year, the commission has a very clear and explicit discussion about its fund balance, so that you all really are well-informed and involved in deciding how it's allocated.
So what is the process to get the Board of Supervisors to approve
They don't approve
Well, in the
this.
policy, it says that.
Oh, well, they do, the fund balance does go as part of the
That's what I-
budget.
Okay, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm
So
sorry.
at the budget that we send to them in April, it's there.
Includes
Okay.
the allocation of the fund balance.
They approve the ending balance, not the movement of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other commissioners have any questions at this point?
So do you want to change what's in the policy and have a policy revision on the agenda next time?
Well, I understand it now. If everybody else is happy with the language, I don't need it changed for me.
And so long as we're told
So
every
long
year.
as you have a report and you make a,
Right.
I think what we need to change is the commission needs to make explicit decisions annually as part of the budget process about how this is allocated and how we're restoring any money that we take out of the,
Do we need to put that in the policy, that there's an annual assignment by the commission?
I think we could probably put in the policy section just a statement that annually during its budget process, the commission will review and approve the allocation so that it's documented.
Very good. Thank you.
So, currently then, what's the balance of our unassigned fund balance?
Unassigned?
If I look at this page here, can I, maybe I'm not seeing that.
At the end of this year, or at the end of 12/13, it's projected to be minus 73,000 unassigned.
That will be our balance?
That's the general.
That's the
fund.
contribution from the general fund
That's
to
just the
it.
general, that doesn't include your special revenue.
So that your total will be 4.6 million in the entire fund allocated out this way.
But that will all be committed to other things and reserved for,
Yeah, so I understand the total is 4.6, I see that. What I was trying to understand, and I think I understand kind of, the capital improvement fund and et cetera. What I was trying to figure out is the unassigned, which I guess is, in my mind, money that's available in future years to make that
To
reallocate either to pay back, operating costs or to use for the retiree health care. So I was trying to understand what amount actually do we think will be left in that unassigned to use in the future. And I wasn't quite sure if I was understanding correctly, if there would be anything left in there.
I have to tell you, I think I have to relook at that number because I don't, it doesn't compute right off the top of my head with what the draft budget says. And we don't have anybody here from budget.
Oh. because according to this, we've got basically 4.6 million in an account somewhere, and 4.3 of it is committed, and roughly 300,000 is assigned.
Right.
Okay.
And I will have to check on that $73,000 number and why it's showing that way, because I can't off the top of my head figure it out from the budget documents.
So just from a policy point of view, then, next year, I'm going to give you let's just say, we do this in law, hypothetically, we end up spending the 700,000 that we're, at this point, anticipating spending
Right.
out of reserves for the operating budget, and there's nothing left in the unassigned fund, and then you have 18 months to come up with a way to repay that 700,000 out of other monies somewhere? Okay.
But I would suggest that we don't want to have a $700,000.
Well,
Yeah,
would
I was
agree
about
with
to
that.
ask about that myself.
Even though No, because your capital asset maintenance fund is not required to be repaid within 18 months.
No, but she's talking about just the use of fund balance for operating
Operating
cost.
budget.
Oh, the got
700,
750.
yes,
Thank you.
sorry, yes, that's 750.
Now, in the past, it's been my sense that this use of fund balance, like in this case, the 755,000, is to some degree a placeholder because of
Well, it's a preliminary budget, and we know that it'll probably go through a couple more iterations after the end of the fiscal year when we see what the actual bottom line is, and then also depending on what we try to negotiate with in any union negotiations.
So the savings that we would hope to have so that we're living within our operating budget,
Is $755,000.
and that depends a bit on negotiations and
It depends on what, what we've done the last few years is if we save money one year, we then allocate that money we don't put it into the fund balance. It becomes unassigned fund balance that we're going to use for operating costs. In other words, last year we ended the year with a positive balance of $452,000. So we are using that money to close the gap this year so we don't have to so we don't have to cut any more from the budget or request more concessions from the union. So we're using $450,000 from the fund balance essentially this year to balance the budget. We didn't put it back into.
Right. But is that then, that 750 anticipates on top of the 450 that we're
Yes.
already using?
Yes. We're using that 450 this year.
Oh, this year, right.
Which is, I believe, Sandy, the 445 that's projected at the top of fiscal year 12-13.
That's the 452 that was put back in?
No, it doesn't show up here.
Oh.
I don't know how they did that. It wasn't added back in that I know of.
What?
Well, because you're projecting to use 445 of fund balance for fiscal year.
But that's for capital and for operating. We're only saying we're using $73,000 for operating.
What is that 452 that got put back in the year before?
That was the savings at the end of, we had $452,000 in positive balance at the end of last fiscal year.
Right.
So we've used it to,
Right.
and if you want to say it inelegantly, plug the hole
Right.
in this year's budget so that we don't have to ask for,
That's how we didn't ask for
Concessions.
furloughs.
yes.
Yes.
755 is a significant amount.
Well, when your workers' compensation goes up 100,000 and other things go up,
Including the 17% increase in healthcare costs.
Well, I mean, it's just,
we had that much last year.
okay.
I mean, what we do is we work through the process of trying to bring that down to zero, and we have for the last several years.
On our monthly reports, will we have a fund balance report? Also?
No, we'll give it to you quarterly.
Okay. Any
It
other-
doesn't change during the year unless you make a budget change. So you really only should be seeing it when you actually make a budget change. It stays stable unless the budget is changed. So we'll give it to you when you make any budget changes so that you can see the impact on the fund balance.
Any other comments from commissioners, questions?
Let me just be clear. Did we decide we did or did not want any language in the policy itself?
I think we did.
Yeah, I liked the suggestion that it said the commission would annually review and approve, or review and,
As part of the budget
as
process.
part of the budget process.
Okay.
That said, any comments from the public? I'll just say I'm glad that we're moving in this direction. It's nice to have this.
My name's Don Schwartz. I'm with the County Administrator's Office, and I'll be reviewing your budget before it goes to the Board of Supervisors. And I'm just really unclear about what the situation of the fund balance is and how that differs from the operating reserve. And Sandy, want to work with you or the commission to get clarification on that before turning the budget into the board. it sounds like there's an operating reserve and there's a fund balance, and I don't see statements on those that, so-
If I understand correctly, the operating reserve is our unassigned fund
Well-
balance. It's part of the fund balance total.
okay. Is that correct?
Operating reserve is your stabilization fund.
Hence, the need for further clarification.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next item, the Special Revenues Fund.
And you have a document that,
It's quite lengthy.
actually it was, no, you got extra pages you shouldn't have gotten in there. So the actual, there was a reason for the blue. You have a document before you that simplifies it down to what you should have received originally.
This one?
Yeah. And it doesn't have the document numbers on it. They're two different documents. This is 1.2.3.1.
1.2.3.1.
Could you hold that up again?
It's in front of you. It's
Yeah,
on the
but
table.
It's this one, I think.
It's this
Yeah,
one.
that's 1.3.2.1.
1.2.3.1.
2.3.
And this is 1.2.3.5, which, I had separated, you know what it is?
They're stapled.
I had left each one of these, what's in front of you is organized differently from what I had left to be copied.
Well, I'm counting on you to explain it because I didn't understand everything that was attached.
Well, you shouldn't have had, you didn't need everything attached. That was the other problem, is that there were a number of items that were worksheets that were attached that shouldn't have been attached. And I see now there's also something attached that,
The thing that says revenue actual transaction? What is that? Are we supposed to get that?
expenditure actual transactions,
Revenue. You got revenue actual, and then expenditure actual transaction.
you know what? You all got a whole bunch of pages that were a breakout of the utilities costs, not the special revenue funds. That should not have been sent.
We also got them on the utilities part, too.
That's what I'm saying, you got them that there is one document attached to that should be 1.3.3.1.
Yeah.
There should only be one sheet for 1.3.3.1. And
It's utilities.
that's utilities, we're not there yet. And then, if you go back, you've got the correct documents, I'm sorry, you do have the correct documents, I was told you did not. Oh, I see you've got, revenue actual transactions needs to be pulled out. These were hidden sheets on the spreadsheets and got printed out. You can pull all those revenue actual transactions and expenditure actual transactions out, which is about, yeah.
It's interesting to look at.
Yeah, so you can just, I apologize. You have the right special revenue pages in your packet. You just have extra pages. So disregard what's in front of you. I apologize.
I don't know, I found this very interesting. Ice cream sundaes and
There's something here about the Teen Lounge junk journals I'd like to discuss.
I'll ask Kathy to speak to that.
Shows our due diligence, we didn't.
Yes, yes, so now you know where every penny went. What we have provided for you is a breakout of the budget and actual for each of the special revenue funds, and those have the highlighting in blue. And then, what's missing is one of the pages. The one that is 1.2.3.5, which shows you each of the special revenue fund breakdowns. This one. By sub-fund. This one. So you should have a cover sheet, a special revenue funds, gifts and donations, year-to-date, special revenue fund, library and branch projects, year-to-date, et cetera, Cromwell bequest, and then the wine library fund, year-to-date. Then you should have something that's headed Special Revenue Fund Summary. That may have only been in what's in front of you right now, I can't tell.
It was at the very back of the packet we got.
It is, but it's reproduced on what you just handed out.
Okay. So, now that you're thoroughly confused. Oh. I wanted to make sure you were familiar with the way they're currently allocated out into funds. Wanted you to be familiar with what the budget was for this year, what the year-to-date is, what the proposed third quarter adjustments are, and then also agree to the way the budgets are allocated for next year. So you can approve those in your, at your April meeting when you approve the budget. So you have, right now we have the special revenue funds, we have 4 of them. One is gifts and donations, which is Friends Funds, Small Bequests, and Funds for Special Projects. Library and branch projects, which is large bequests, the Memorial Book Fund and the Petaluma Building Fund. The Cromwell bequest has its own fund, and the Hopkins really should.
That's, I was going to ask.
It should.
Okay.
And then the Wine Library Fund, which is primarily money from the Wine Library Associates. So we've given you the breakdown for each one of those that shows you the approved budget, what we spent from the year to, in the year to date, what the variance is, and then what third quarter adjustments we project need to be made. And that's on the action agenda for the special meeting. And then the suggested budget for 13-14, which will be on the agenda for the April meeting.
For these funds, the anticipated budget, we don't try to anticipate that we'll be gifted more things, that this just has to do with what's already in there and where we're going with it.
We do try to anticipate some level of income, but it's really sort of just based on general patterns of the past and can vary widely.
And is the reason that the interest on pooled cash is so far under is that the interest rates are down, or that we just haven't received it yet?
A combination of the two. We have adjusted several of them downward because they're overly generous in the projections that were in the budget originally.
I'd like to step back for just a second in terms of the allocation of, like you were saying, the Hopkins should probably be in the Cromwell.
No, it shouldn't be in the Cromwell, but it's material enough that it ought to have its own fund. And for some reason, Elisa hadn't done that. So it's a correction.
It is separately stated in your
Financial
statement, but
statement.
there is no separate famous
Index.
subledger index code for it.
Okay.
It is accounted for in the budget and finance office separately, but in famous, when you look at the index codes, there is no separate index code for it.
So we just have to see if we can get an index code so it can be all by itself in its own fund.
Okay, and related to, again, the Petaluma, I'm wearing my Petaluma hat here, by the way, just so people are, I noticed that the Buffum Fund is it in gifts and, gifts and donations?
Wait a second, I have to figure out. Buffalo is in the larger bequests.
It's in library and branch, I believe.
Yeah, it's in the larger, it's in library and branch projects.
Okay, because that's where I think it should be. It's my father-in-law.
Well, we could give him his own little special index fund just.
No,
as-
but I think he wanted it for building. That's his goal, is the
Well,
building.
And
okay.
it's on that document that I actually found very useful was that last one that shows them all and
Right.
talks about what their purpose is and what branch they go to. And it does show that it's for building improvements in Petaluma only.
And on that document, Sandy, correct me if this is right, it appears to me that there's just under 200,000 that's appears to be system-wide, no restrictions, where everything else is either, geographically specific and a purpose specific.
I think you're right. The two that are,
I see two that
right.
seem completely
the,
open.
Sadowski and the Curtis were two
Yeah.
bequests that we received sort of over the transom that had no specific.
And there's some other that are system-wide, but they're like specific to children's services.
Right.
Or books and materials or something
Right.
like that. So
Right.
as far as I could see, those two look like the most, it's not
Flexibility.
specifically defined, most flexible.
Right, and you'll see later on that what we're suggesting is that we pay for the strategic planning process and the classification and compensation projects out of those two.
Okay.
Are there any limits at all to what they can be spent on?
No. Other than the library. So are you clear that there are two sets of actions here, that one for today, later on the adjustments for this year's budget, so we have enough appropriated for what our projected expenditures are from these funds? And then you'll be asked to approve the 13-14 budget.
Any questions,
Helena, does this begin to get at the kind of breakout you've been saying you wanted?
Thank you very much.
just for my information, in terms of the, looking at the last page, 1.2.3.5, parents, 3.25.13 parents.
March 25th.
I'm wondering about, like, for example, I assume that the people in Petaluma know that there's $10,000 to spend on Spanish language books.
I assume so too. Those are in the hierarchy. Is that in the hierarchy, Jamie? Yeah.
Okay.
We have a whole separate budget that's broken down with great granularity for the materials budget, that it lives in Horizon. And that's what we call the hierarchy.
Okay. And the Southwest Santa Rosa Library Trust and the Southwest Santa Rosa Library Collections basically sit there until something happens in the Southwest?
either that or the commission decides to do something else with them, but since there's discussion of trying to do something for Southwest, then I would suggest you want to leave them there.
So if we wanted to try to do some sort of outpost or do something a little creative in Southwest, that money might be available for it?
It was originally put there when we thought we were going to have a Southwest Santa Rosa Library branch.
Right.
So, I
Where
would.
did it come from? Did it come from our regular budget, or was it
No,
donation?
I think there are two sources. I think there's more than one, more than those two.
Yeah, because there's it says Fund Development Office
Yes.
on line, whatever, 36, and then it's got the 112. It says for new library. Who's the Fund Development Office?
When I first came, there was actually someone who was doing fundraising, and they were very much focused on fundraising for Southwest Santa Rosa. So that's money that the Fund Development Office, which existed at one point,
Of the
raised.
library.
Yeah.
So we're sort of, we're obligated to use it for Southwest, certainly.
I think we probably want to use it for that purpose.
But to Julia's point, if we weren't in position to open a full branch, but could do something
use this for
to provide
collections.
service.
Right, collections, it would go very fast.
Yeah.
Right, but we're looking at roughly 150,000 there.
Right.
Between the three.
Right. We've had some overtures from LC Allen about discussing space in their new building or something. That's just happened.
Okay.
At the JPA committee meeting, Roger did it, Roger, who's now left, did an interesting analogy about the thinning of the soup, and that as we open more branches or provide more services without increasing staffing, we're thinning the soup down to broth.
That's exactly why we don't have enough staff now, because when they opened Rohnert Park and when they opened Rincon Valley, Rohnert Park, they had some staff.
Windsor.
And Windsor, I call it, he's probably more elegant, I called it cannibalizing the staff at other branches, which is why we have such odd staffing around us. They just kind of chew them up. Pac-Man. I think if you don't have any more questions, do you have any observations?
No, I just have a comment around the special revenue funds. I think when you look at this document 1.2.3.5, it brings me back to the conversation we had a few years ago about gift acceptance policy and the need to get something more formalized, because, you can see that if you continue, there's some gifts in here that are being tracked at the $1,000 level, and the management of that and the use of it and where it gets allocated to can become really cumbersome over time in the absence of having a formal gift acceptance policy, where if someone makes a contribution for $1,000, you've got a vehicle for them to put that money into, not a particular line item that has to be traced forever. So I would keep that high on your priority list around special revenue funds.
What should the cutoff be for,
Well, I think
Tracking.
we have to, Will and I don't always agree on this one because we have to be sensitive to our donors.
Oh, absolutely. There are donor sensitivity issues, and then there are fiscal management issues, and you've got to somehow balance them. So I'm not saying you can't take a donation for $1,000, but as management and commission and people who work in fundraising, when you look at where people want to give in the library, have a vehicle for them to give into that fits their need.
And actually, we do have one that I think kind of is like that, which is the Memorial Book Fund, which is if somebody gives money in memory of somebody else for materials, it all just goes into that fund. So you're talking about having more funds like that, where
At the Education Foundation, we went through this a few years ago, trying to deal with the sensitivity of meeting donors' needs, especially in memorial situations, and meeting the administrative abilities of the organization to map all of those needs
So
and donations.
Would it make sense to, or do we already have, like the Memorial Book Fund, would it make sense to just have a fund for each branch that we track? And then when things are given for a particular branch, it goes into that?
Well, but see, we get things for books at Sonoma Valley. We get
Right.
things for children's programs at Sonoma Valley. We get,
But
you
then
know,
once it's broken out by branch, can you break it out by
well, that's still
branch?
the same
Yeah.
It's still, yeah.
granularity of tracking.
It's a lot of tracking.
So I don't think I've seen the memorial book policy. Is it possible you could,
We don't have a memorial book policy.
what did you just say?
We have a
I said
fund.
the practice is to put the money into a memorial book fund if people
Oh,
give
so we
us.
have nothing really written up.
No.
So Will, you worked with staff on this, to document the special fund stuff? Is there anything, any documentation about?
When GASB 54 got implemented, we went through, not at this level that staff is now prepared, but we went through the Hopkins, the Cromwell.
There are about a half dozen or, I mean,
Hopkins,
there's
Cromwell.
9 to 12 different
The bigger,
bequests.
more material ones that are presented separately in your financial statements. We went back all the way to the legal documents of when that money came in, to sit down with staff and determine whether there were endowment restrictions on that money based on the way the language was written when the money was gifted. That's as far as auditors as we went in, was just to those material funds that are presented separately in the financials. This was not prepared by us.
If you receive something that is not a bequest, but a donation, and the person or entity that donated is still alive, can you go back and get a written, can we use it for something different, ask, and then they?
If you get a generic donation in the absence of any specific instruction, it's,
No, but let's say you get a specific one for one branch, and you go back and say, can we use it for a different branch? You just get something in writing from the donor saying it's okay, and then
you could, yes.
you could
But
legally?
whether you want to or
Well,
not.
no, I understand, that's a different issue. I'm just asking if you're even allowed to.
But I just want to follow up on the administrative kind of question you bring up, or structure. And I hear the point that we get these very specific requests, but if we had a structure where we had a fund for each branch, and when people wanted to make a contribution, advise them, we have a structure where we have a fund for each branch. Would you like to put your $1,000 or your whatever into that? Would that simplify our management of this?
Yes.
So maybe that's something we should consider. And yes, there could be some patrons who are very specific and don't want their $1,000 going into that generic, whatever, Petaluma Fund or Runner Park Fund. But I'm going to guess most people who want to make a modest donation, to their local branch would say, great, take my $1,000 and put it in the,
At the
Santa Rosa
Education
Fund.
Foundation, we created educational focus buckets, basically, so we had, literacy, performing arts, physical education, science. We created general enough areas that through the donor education process, we really didn't face challenges. We found the right place for people's money to go into for whatever they were interested in donating for.
Okay.
I don't think you'll resolve it in one commission meeting, but it's definitely, it changes your donor outreach too.
And that brings up a question I have, and I don't know what's happening with development or any future campaigns. There's nothing.
We don't have any staff to do that sort of thing.
That's what I thought, but it would help if we had some kind of designated buckets, as Will said, and have that at least on the website.
I would also make the suggestion that we work with the foundation, which is that's the countywide fundraiser, and it's in the process of redefining and re-upping itself, and a conversation with them and on their website and their donor outreach could help then funnel into buckets, and because a lot of the funds come through the foundation, the donations get funneled through the foundation.
So with that point about the foundation, do these small requests and the bequests reflect what's coming through the foundation? Okay, so that's a different entity.
Usually what comes through
Right.
the foundation comes in and goes out for a specific purpose.
Okay,
So it doesn't sit in the special revenue funds.
so the library outside of the foundation brings in money separately?
In fact, most of the money comes in primarily through Friends, but we do sometimes get bequests, and we also get donations. We have certain people who donate $1,000 every year in December for CDs and for the Occidental Rural Station, you know. We have some things like that.
Well, that seems like it's an important thing as a revenue source, so that maybe I know it's a future discussion point, but I know in my world, we have to do what Will's suggesting, that we really have to designate, and we do fancy things like you're a diamond donor or you're a platinum donor, you know.
Well, and
but
those are the things that we would look to the foundation to be doing.
Gotcha, okay, thank you.
So, is there a step we need to take or that we should take to request, maybe some way of creating the structure that would be less impactive of staff time tracking this going forward, and just create some generic buckets?
It's on the list of priority policies.
Okay.
It's supposed to, it had been in process for quite some time.
Any other questions or comments from the commission? Comments from the public? There being none, shall we have a 10-minute break?
Yes. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Now, on to the next issue, follow-up staff reports. Hours of service and adequate staffing levels, 1.3.1. Some background, Sandy?
Well, I have provided you with the document I sent to Don. That was an attempt to explain the savings from the closing and the cost of reopening, which clearly still is not clear enough. I hear loud and clear that it's not clear. Then, in response to the request that I had, we provided you with some suggested staffing models for a 40-hour week and for a 52-hour week, aimed at trying to both even out and smooth out staffing by size of library for the 40 hours. And then and that FTE ends up being close to the FTE that it would take, that we have vacant. And then the 52-hour is much more expensive. It's trying to make sure we have enough Tech 2s and Tech 3s to both cover and help cover at other libraries. And then also, it adds a library associate, at least one, to each library. They can fill in for both the librarians and the circ people. They're sort of jack of all trades who can help out with the librarian's tasks, as well as fill in more comfortably for the tech people. One of the concerns or issues, I think, is that one of the silver linings of being closed, just having the 5 days a week schedule, is you have full staffing on Fridays and Saturdays, so they can do programming, particularly programming for kids and families on Saturdays, which they cannot do now. They could not do when we had the old 52-hour model, because they were only, half the staff worked on Friday and half the staff worked on Saturday. So they had skeleton staffing on Fridays and Saturdays, which kept them from being able to do programming and that kind of thing. But it frees having a library associate at each branch frees the librarians up to do their librarian tasks, whether it's selection or program planning or outreach in the community or those kinds of things that we're not currently doing to the extent that we have in the past or that we need to be. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. So, to bring us up to the full staffing for the number of hours we are currently open.
Right.
There's the 40-hour model.
Right.
What staffing model do you use? How did you determine that 7 more full-time positions were needed?
It was mostly looking at workload factors, looking at the workload at various branches and trying to smooth out the staffing. We separated it into tiers by size of library. Central is in a category all by itself. Then we have a 2A and 2B category in Petaluma and Rankin Valley, Petaluma and Roanoke Park are 2A. They're the two larger, they're 25 and 30,000 square feet. So when you combine levels of use with size of library, we tried to make them equitable. Then you've got the 2Bs, which are Sebastopol, Rincon, Northwest. Those libraries are about, Rincon is larger, but it's open enough that they have sight lines. But when Rincon was probably the most understaffed for its workload and size, but we tried to make all 3 of those libraries be at least close to one another as in the techs and in the technician 2s and 3s, and then Sonoma, Windsor, and Healdsburg are in another category, and Cloverdale and Guerneville are in another category. So we looked at minimum staffing, we looked at usage, and tried to give similar staffing models to similar sized libraries with similar levels of use.
But those underlying, I guess my question was actually more broad than what was specifically done here in determining that, okay, so for Petaluma, the staff to patron ratio, where does the staff to patron ratio ideal number come from? Is that just something in the library?
There's no, you have to look at usage,
Right.
and what their circulation is, what the size of the building is, and all of those kinds of things. So that's what we looked at, was what's the size of the building, what's the level of use? I mean, what do they need sightlines for? What do they need to handle the workload that they've got? So, for instance, Healdsburg has circulation actually that's closer to Cloverdale and Guerneville. But they also have the special library. So we took that in. They have the wine library, which is an extra responsibility. So we took that into account.
Sandy, did you consider the use of volunteers at all in this plan?
No, because we can't use volunteers to do many of the types of work that staff does. It's bargaining unit work.
And
We already use volunteers extensively. And, I'm sorry.
And so if we were to increase the use of volunteers, we would need that change to be reflected in the agreement with the union?
No, there's a basic principle about not having volunteers do bargaining unit work. So if a task is considered bargaining unit work, we cannot have volunteers doing it.
So we would have to negotiate a change in the definition of bargaining unit work before we could have a volunteer do it.
Which is probably,
No, I understand. Just clarifying.
I don't think they're going to give up tasks.
Thank you.
Any other comments from the commission?
Well, I have a couple of questions. So I'm assuming Tier 1, those are the larger, busier libraries?
Tier 1 is central.
But it's, so maybe explain the tiers. You said it's based on the size of the building, it says here, 3 tiers. The estimates were arrived at by reviewing the current staffing levels, minimum staffing guidelines, and branch service indicator statistics. So is that what the tier, I'm not sure I understand the tiers.
Well, the tiers come from the minimum staffing guidelines, which separate out the libraries by those factors like size of the building, level of usage, normal staffing levels, those kinds of things.
Okay, so that was what I was.
Yeah.
So
the
tier
tiers.
1 is,
2A is Petaluma and Roner.
so they're bigger, busier libraries at those tier 1, 2, and it kind of goes from
Right.
there? Okay. And on your chart, I know you're very used to it, but we're not as familiar with how it was set up. So the current total FTE, if you look at table 1, that's the current total FTE,
21.1 for Central.
And so that wouldn't change under adequate staffing
For 40 hours.
for 40 hours. So, okay, so these are the differences at 40 hours. So there wouldn't be a whole lot of change. It doesn't look like, except maybe at Cloverdale, there might be a,
Well, there's change at Rincon because that's one of the libraries that
okay, I see that, yeah. 6 to 7 to 8.
they really are understaffed for their workload. But
And Northwest.
Well, everybody gets added except Central and Healdsburg.
Roanoke Park's
and
got a
Heels-
one increase.
Healdsburg does get a half-time Tech 3
Oh, okay.
and a half-time Tech 2. Wait, that's at 12 hours. At 0 hours, they get a half-time Tech 3.
And under the other model, for 50 to 52 hours a week, it would go from a total FTE of 96 to 116.1.
Right,
So
right.
what is that, about 20?
20.
20 and a half?
So there's adding in the library associate and also doing some more adding in of library technicians 2 and 3. The only librarian, there's some smoothing out of librarians at that level, and also adding back the librarian 3 at the central library. It's one of the retirements. That really, right now, the span of control for the central library manager is 17 people report to her. So this would put back the coordinator of the adult reference services, who also could provide some system-wide services too for coordination of some reference and activities.
And you're estimating the cost to be 1.3 plus 10%.
No, but the total, you have to add in the other one. It's 1.7 for the full, right? It's
Right, it would
1.7.
be 390.
You got to add both.
Okay.
And
Because
those
the
are,
52 hours just assumes you've already brought it up to the 40-hour
Right.
total already. Okay,
Right.
Got it.
and there's the adding in of the indirect costs particularly because of the additional workload factors for system-wide staff. And this was based on, the way we typically do budgets is we take the middle of the range for the position, for the salary, and then add 30% for projected benefits, which is the way we usually budget for positions. So that's where those numbers came from.
Okay, thanks. And then I had a question, on the 180,000 for per a single branch to open 8 hours with a skeleton crew. The reason it didn't feel like it added up is if you take the 9 branches, right? There's 9 branches plus the 2.
What page are you on?
If you're looking
You're
at.
going back to the memo to Don.
Oh, yes, sorry.
That was just based on the staffing model we have currently at Central.
Okay, but if you multiply 180,000 by 9, it adds up to according to my calculator, like over $1 million.
Well, that would, yes, but the idea was, the question I was asked for the report was only what would it take to open another library on Monday, staffing it like we do on Sunday.
So I came up with 1.6 million for 180,000 times 9 libraries, and that's a lot more than
Actually, there are 11 libraries.
but not full libraries.
They're 13 when you count the 2 rurals, but with Central,
Oh, there's 11, so that makes it more, okay.
There's 9 cities, but Santa Rosa.
11
there are 3.
libraries.
So, just so I understand that 180 is what you're saying, that 180,000 is the cost at Central today to be open on Sundays?
No, because we're only open 4 hours on Sundays.
Okay,
It's based on roughly what the staffing model is for Central on Sundays, doubled.
okay. So what you're saying then is, today, it's 90,000 a year to have Central opened on Sundays?
that's correct.
And you doubled it, and that's where that number came from? Is that, we're just trying to understand where the
Yeah,
number
I
came
mean,
from.
that was basically what we looked at, was what the average staffing model is for halftime, and then doubled it. These are very rough numbers.
Yeah,
mean,
so
they're-
I think it
They
doesn't-
give some sense of what the relative cost would be.
Yeah, and I think that that's the confusing part for people looking at this is, so with 11 branches at 180,000, that's almost $2 million. And that doesn't really, it can't cost that much, really. It's not how much we saved from closing, and not every branch would have as many staff as Central.
Well, that's true, you can't just multiply
So it
180.
seems like
It
maybe
was if
take
you
a middle range for what it would
Well,
cost.
The
So I
more rational, the more detailed approach would be to really, what I would propose doing, and I didn't have time to do it between these 2 meetings, is to look at those staffing levels on the other sheet. And how many people do we really need, on average per day, and what would that cost? Plus a 10% factor for indirect costs to do that. So that's the way I would come up. Both of these were simply ballpark figures, what the question that Tim asked me to answer was, if we opened another library using the Sunday staffing model, what would that cost? That's where the 180,000 came from. And the other numbers came from simply dividing the cost of running any one of these branches for 40 hours, dividing it by 5. So you come out with a cost per 8-hour day, and that's where the staffing models numbers came from for the second one.
And you can see how it doesn't add up, because if you take that model and you multiply it by 5 days, pretty much it's going to exceed our budget for running every single branch.
No,
over
you'd
the
be
year.
surprised. You'd be
Well, if
surprised.
it's 2 million, if it's 1.9 million to have 1 day a week for 11 branches,
Yeah, but
that doesn't.
We have a $15 million budget.
so you multiply that by 6 or 5, and you're still within how many days a week
That's
are we
9.9,
open? That's about right.
but I don't. So let's look at our services, how much we spend on services.
I'd
I
also
think
like,
you need to go back to that cost per branch document that we did for the city managers and that I shared with you all a few meetings ago. I think most people don't realize how much each branch costs to run.
the other thing that I think that's interesting is it feels like we've fallen into an either-or scenario, that we either are open 40 hours or we're open 52 to get back to where we were. And I know this is going to cloud the issue, and
Thank you, Tim.
but
It's not already cloudy enough.
it's not all cloudy enough. We're going to get a heavier fog in here, but that
You're from Petaluma, it's foggy down there.
yeah, that as we begin to think, we've got lots of things to think about in terms of increasing hours or increasing salaries, or increasing staffing, or paying for the unfunded liability, or whatever. But perhaps there's a middle ground between 40 and 52 that can begin to be worked into. So I don't know how we have
You're
numbers.
not asking me to price those two, are you?
I am not at the moment.
Positive.
I'm just offering the concept that perhaps we don't only need to think in 40 or 52.
Sure.
Yeah, but Tim, it seems to me why waste time on any number bigger than 40 until we adequately staff and pay for 40?
The only reason to waste time on that is that a good vocal part of the population is telling us they want Mondays back, and perhaps having information about what it would require to get Mondays back, besides just having 52 hours. For example, I'm here. Suppose we had 44 hours, 45 hours, and we re-looked at the schedule, and we were open a shorter amount each day, but we were open on Monday. Maybe that is information that would be useful as we try to reconstruct.
And then I think the other question is, one of the cost-saving measures was having everybody on an identical schedule and floating staff back and forth. But as we've discovered, that has its own problems and is not necessary. I mean, we're going to end up spending a bunch of money on extra help anyway. So I think maybe the other question would be is what does it add to our budget if we did a little bit of staggering of the scheduling so that one library or two libraries were open Monday but closed a different day, and other library branches were open those days. I mean, if we went back to a more staggered schedule, that might alleviate some of the frustration and upset we hear from the public about not having any accessibility on Mondays, but that is something that might be worth costing out. I know that's a lot more work. I do recognize, I'm not suggesting we need that, but I'm just saying that that's another option that we
Sure.
might want to consider without increasing hours and recognizing how understaffed we are.
Well, if you're going to recognize how understaffed you are, then you probably have to go fewer hours.
But staggered. I mean, that may be another solution, is that we say to people, okay, there will be a branch in the county open more. Some branch will be open for more time, but it's not always going to be the same branch.
Those are all possibilities in the room of hours that we can open up.
But, that begs the question, how much time do you want to spend on the question of different models for open hours and how much that would cost? Or you still have the demand for the COLA, you still have the demand for OPEB. I think you all are going to have to come to some consensus about where you want to go with this. We can spend a lot of time giving you scenarios, but
I think if we are going to say, look, increasing our hours is not one of the priorities for when money starts coming in, that we have other things we want to spend our money on first, then a scenario that allows some branch to be open more, that we can direct patrons to, well, yes, your branch is closed, but you can go here on
well, I
this
think
day.
you'd have to look at having at least 3 open on any
Okay.
one day because of the size of the county. And then so I think you even have to make some decisions about that. Just having one library open creates issues in a geographically diverse
Right.
area. And also, if you only have 3 open, then you have to staff them at a higher level than they're normally staffed when all the other libraries are open.
We only have Central open on Sundays, so I'm
Right.
not sure
That's-
that what you're saying is the only option is to have 3.
Well, or to do something, because Central for 4 hours is hell on wheels, quite frankly, for the staff. Because they work without breaks and for 4 hours
Right,
straight.
So have more staff, have Central open maybe longer on Sunday and on Monday.
I don't think long-
In any event,
Anyway,
I don't know that we want to
there's all
spend
kinds of
time on this
options.
now.
Yeah, see, that's
But-
what I mean. We could spend a lot of time spinning scenarios, but you're asking, I'm asking for a little more discussion at this level about what you really want to try to do before we start spinning scenarios, because the resources to spin scenarios are limited.
but
Well,
my-
go ahead.
I was going to say, from the discussion we started with at our last budget meeting, where we talked about what the priorities for when money starts coming in might be, it seemed to me like adding hours was not high on the priority list. Bringing staffing up to staffing levels got the top priority for most people. OPEB was a big one. Southwest actually was, having underserved areas get some attention. But if we are going to work on the assumption that we're not going to be, just adding back in Monday and bringing us up to the hourly levels that we were at for some time, then I think we want to look at alleviating some of the public pressure in some creative way.
And I think we have to be realistic. I mean, we don't have 1.7 million to throw at
No.
this. I mean, I think we're all concerned when we look and we see that we're on paper anyway, taking, well over 700,000 theoretically out of reserves for next year just to cover operating costs. So, and there's huge pressure to do something on Monday, and we know that. But, I don't see us, even as things improve, being in a position to move to certainly the full freight and even the 40-hour, which doesn't really get us any additional hours, right? I mean, but we're looking at adding a few 100,000 minimum there. I don't see where that's coming from money-wise.
Can I ask, if we were fully staffed for the 40 hours, would we be in a position to do a staggered schedule?
Well, you'd still have to spend extra money on extra help. You'd have to increase your extra help budget.
Right, but, I mean, that's something to ask if we did full-time employees or permanent, actual employees not using extra help then what would the gap look like and what type of extra help budget would we need? But again, these are just
Well,
ideas.
the extra help budget is difficult, but if you start staggering, then you don't have the ability to move people around.
As much, but you'll have some overlap.
Some, but not on the days. You're still going to have days where the
Right.
people who are available are going to be limited.
So the thing that seems clear to me is that a next step that the commission needs to deal with is to establish our priorities for what we do as the funding increases.
Well, remember, that's the whole purpose of the strategic planning process.
Right, too.
Which would be to gather information to inform your discussions, so you're not sitting in isolation doing that. And we're not going to have the money to do it for at least a year anyway. I mean, I don't see the money coming back
That fast.
that fast. So I think you have ample opportunity for discussion over the next year.
And another area where we might get input is the labs. The labs may have, if we present the issues of what
I
are.
think you want to go through this strategic planning process so you look broadly, and labs would be a significant part of that.
Okay.
But it should be, I think you want a systematic approach to gathering information on options that includes various types of information gathering and looks at data and those kinds of things all together and not just sort of piecemeal it.
Very good, and we're working on strategic plan process.
Well, it's on the priorities,
Right.
yes.
Okay,
But if we're spending scenarios, we're not doing strategic planning.
I understand. Are there other comments on this part?
I'd just like to make a general comment. Susan, you made a reference to great pressure to be open on Mondays. I have to say that it seems to me we have a few sort of vocal people, but I don't see it as a big issue. I truly don't.
It's very different from community to community.
I attended, and I think Paul did too, various open houses at Roner Park. They've had 2 this week from, organized by the lab. And I wasn't involved in the creation of they had a room full of butcher paper, basically, to write on. And their areas were hours, let's see, books and materials, and general. Just as an aside, I would have liked one called funding, but
No, you ask people what they want the funding for, you don't ask them if they want funding.
no,
'cause they'll always
what
say
they
want
suggest
it.
is alternatives for funding.
Oh, I see.
But the sheets that I read on regarding hours were kind of interestingly mixed. There was, of course, the Give Us Back Mondays, but there was a whole range of give us Mondays and don't give us Saturdays, or give us, so there was some of the things that Julia was talking about looking at it flexibly, but it was pretty much an issue at that meeting, at that event.
It sounds like they just want more hours, but where the hours are, they don't necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, we'll be getting some sort of report from the results of that open house discussion, but that was what I saw on the wall. But so there is that.
And I wasn't here when the discussion took place about what days to close, but I assume that in general, Monday and Sunday were the 2 days that were used less in the majority of the libraries. Is that
No,
what I
that was
picking?
not the reason.
Oh, okay.
And Sundays, we were only open at Central. We weren't open at any other library. We didn't change the hours on Sundays. We closed on Mondays so that staff could have back-to-back 2 days off.
I see. So it wasn't based on usage?
No, if it were based on usage, we'd be closed on Friday or probably later in the week. But then staff would not get the back-to-back 2 days off.
Makes sense.
Any other comments from the?
And let me say that as you work with other libraries and talk to other libraries, it's not at all unusual for this kind of schedule. It's very common as a cost-saving measure to be closed on Mondays.
Well, and I just want to say, I think hours is actually a burning issue for the patrons of the library. So whether it's open, and I think Monday is an issue. Even if we were open not the full day on Monday or had staggered hours, it would be a good thing. But I do believe, perhaps not in the eastern part of the county, but the rest of the county, everybody has come up and said hours are important to them, almost universally. So
I hear mostly Monday up at the north end of the county. It's, they want Monday open again.
Yeah, but are they willing to give up another day in the week?
Probably not. Part of the problem is a couple of times this happened where the library was closed, and I think it might be one coming up 4 days in a row.
No, only 3.
Okay.
Saturday, Sunday, Monday, for a Monday holiday.
Okay, and that caused a lot of consternation. A lot of people were upset about that. I don't know what can be done about that because of the contract days off that we have.
Right.
So, it's just the way it is, but there is a lot of bitching and moaning about that.
There it is. Okay, other comments from the commission? Public, open to the public comment? Any comments from the public? Okay, wait, let's go on. We should wait till the end of all 3, or should?
No,
Okay.
my point was, I was getting ready for the literacy.
Okay, literacy.
That's Kathy.
Hello, we have, I think this is the
Is
third.
that on, is that,
I believe it's on. Can we put a little bit closer? How's that?
Good.
Better? Okay. This is, I think, the third year we have presented an annual report on the literacy program for the commission. One of, and I'm assuming that you've all had a chance to read through it, one of the primary changes this year is that we did have restored, I'd say about 75% of the state money that was cut last year. So Let's see, other changes that happened this year. This year, we did have to write a proposal to the sheriff's department. They actually opened up all of their adult education to bid for services, not just literacy, but other education opportunities for their inmates across the county. Or they opened the bidding process to the county. We did prepare a bid, and we were awarded that contract. The amount, of course, was the same as it had been the previous years, and actually a lot of it was similar to what it had been the previous years, although this year we are offering to the inmates, through one of our contracted teachers, we're offering not just literacy classes, but also a financial literacy class. We don't have any statistics on that yet, because it's just starting. Looking at the document 1.3.2.1, let's see, I'm gonna just kind of talk through this as if this is the first time we were presenting it to you. The literacy program does have 4 different components to the programs it offers. The primary component is the basic adult education, which is the one-to-one volunteer and learner tutoring that is coordinated out of the office across the street here, but it actually takes place across the county. The learners come and say, I need to learn to read, I need to, I have literacy learning needs. They are matched with a volunteer tutor from their community. So I think Sonoma has a lot of volunteer tutor pairs that meet in the library and at the schedule of those people they coordinate together. I know Cloverdale has a good number. I actually don't have statistics from Julie as to how many learners in each community, and actually that might be something to include in for future years. But it is a county-wide program, although it does operate out of the Santa Rosa Central Annex across the street. So that's a piece that I wanted to clarify. That, as I said, is the bread and butter, the primary focus of our adult literacy program, and that also is the piece where the funding was cut last year. As part of the cuts with the funding last year, we scaled back a lot on the materials that were purchased, i.e. workbooks and giveaways for the families of children with the Families for Literacy portion of that program. A lot of that, those cuts were in that area of materials. Some of the training opportunity, or they used to do monthly trainings for new tutors, and I think they had to scale that back last year as well. Part of the cost is not just bringing on new tutors, but then giving them services, maintaining the information that those tutors need to know in order to maintain them and continue to educate them and continue to give them support to work with their learners. And I think that's something that had to scale back last year. This year, when I'd say 70% of the funding came back, we have been able to, I think, bring those new volunteer trainings back, and then also that the workbooks and materials have come back as well. The EL Civics classes is funded by the WIA Title II grant. That's the second component to the library's literacy program. Those operate at schools that don't actually happen at the library. They happen at locations across, I believe there are some in Santa Rosa and some are in Forestville, I think. Sorry. Julie Dabbs, who is the coordinator of the program, she was unable to come today, and I know that she can always answer questions that I don't know the answers to. But the actual locations I am forgetting right now. But those classes are contracted teachers, and they are weekly classes that they hold where they have specific goals for learning skills that help them in their everyday life. They call that EL Civics, which is English, what is it? Is it English language? Is what the EL is for? I'm sorry. Let's go back. On page 4 of the report, it's English language civics curriculum. Yes, that's the skills like how to interview, how to read your child's report card, how to, other very specific learning goals where a person who doesn't have that control of the written English language or even the communicated English language can learn specifically in a class how to handle these specific situations. The third component of the literacy program is the contract with the sheriff department, the classes that are offered in the county jail, funded by the contract with the sheriff. We have 2 contracted teachers. The teachers for that program actually have to go through a very complex procedure of actual verification through the sheriff's department where they fingerprinted and have to pass tests and this and that. So we try to maintain at least a couple people who we can send to the jail, because if say that teacher left or quit, it takes like about 6 months to get a new teacher certified, is my understanding. And those are set up on a schedule through the sheriff's department. And then the fourth component are classes that are taught at the Grayton Day Labor Center, and we have twice a week classes that are taught on, again, English, ESL and literacy classes. Some of the funding issues, as we talked about the state funding, I think one of the reasons that when state funding was cut from 3 different areas last year, and when it came back, it only came back to literacy. And one of the reasons I believe that it came back to literacy is because with the federal funding that we get, it is dependent on having state funds matching. And therefore, they wanted to make sure that federal funding was also maintained, so they sent back some of that money to the state literacy program.
I think another piece of that is that from a legislative and advocacy point of view, the literacy programs are very vocal and very effective.
And high profile, yes.
Yes.
And if I could just add to that, also, was it about 8 years ago, they separated the California Library Literacy Services money from the general library budget. So
From the
that's
state library budget.
Yeah, the state. So that kind of helped protect that bit of the money.
Well, it didn't protect it last year, but this year it
Right.
did. The Sonoma County Library, we are funding a good amount, $149,000 was this year's budgeted money from the library. Part of that is salaries and benefits. A piece of my salary comes from that. As they were talking before about kind of 10%, any grant funding, we have to match 10%, which indicates the indirect costs and, electricity and postage and that kind of stuff. But the library is funding a fair amount. Actually, I was looking at the budget over time, and I think what we gave you here is the past 3, or the current year plus the past 2 years of what the literacy budget looked like. We actually haven't seen a ton of change other than that big cut from the CLLS last year. Looking at the change in revenues by year.
Can I ask a question about that?
Please do.
Because I'm looking at, jumping ahead to our proposed budget and looking at the line that says literacy. Is this not, Sandy, does this line, it's line literacy 78 of document 1.5.1, does this not encompass all the costs of literacy? Because these numbers don't match anywhere near what is literacy.
Sorry, what line
Chart
on
has.
151?
It's sub-object 7180.
7180, sorry.
Those are it doesn't reflect everything. Some of it's the way that they budget for this program.
Well,
This is true, like those are the past years, those are the actual costs, and say we might have budgeted a higher amount and then it came in, they did not spend all their money, is a piece of it, how they're allocating their money is what she's talking about.
right, and so my question is, if in 11-12, we only spent 60,000, why are we allocating 150 this year?
I think that's more a bookkeeping thing, and I think we'll have to come back and answer that for you.
Okay.
It has to do with the way they transfer money in and out. And it has to do with the fact that we're limited in our ability to track the expenditures for that program because of the limitations of FAMUS and our use of FAMUS.
Maybe we should start calling it in.
That's a good question.
Yeah. I'm not sure that the salaries are reflected in that.
Oh,
Well, okay. It is frustrating to
Okay.
not get
Yeah.
numbers that match up.
Yes.
I completely agree.
I couldn't agree more.
I couldn't agree more. That is something that I think that we will look at very closely to see why that is not so. Did you have any other questions about any of the information in the prepared report or in the budget document?
I have a couple.
Okay.
One is the family literacy programs part
Uh-huh.
of this. Is there a coordination going on with the children librarians, the sections in the different libraries? I know at Roanoke Park, they didn't specifically have a family literacy program.
I would say that no, there is not currently a coordinated system-wide, I mean, at the individual branches, pieces of this specific literacy program. My involvement with the literacy program is intended to help with that translation of the literacy focus from the literacy program to the children's librarians. We do, like some of the events that we do, we might not target that, or we might not advertise it as this is part of a literacy program, but a lot of what the children's librarians do is early literacy activities.
What about family literacy, though?
Well, for example, the Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Libros, which is an annual April 30th program, or day. Many of the libraries are doing programming for that, which again, may not be specifically marketed as, this is a family literacy program, or this is related to family literacy. That the whole purpose of that day is to emphasize literacy and welcome families. One thing that I can say to speak to that is that in the digital branch, everything's interrelated, in the digital branch initiative, one of the things that I have been pushing for is to make sure that we have a separate literacy, and I'm thinking more family literacy, early literacy focus, where we can have resources, where we can have parenting things which are for the general population, not just for people who are participating in the literacy program. So,
And
that would be more on the children's librarian side as opposed to on the literacy program side.
right, and I think parents as first teachers is really important, and teaching parents how to read with their kids is really important. And the family literacy programs in the state traditionally are focused on providing free books and having an ongoing program where parents can come in and learn how to read with their children, and they read with their children. And that's what is that a funding issue right now, or is that something we get back to?
We used to have two separate programs under that CLLS. We used to have the FFL, which was the Families for Literacy, and then we had the ALS, which is Adult Literacy Services. And my understanding is that 2 years ago, the state combined those into one program. So in terms of reporting and funding, it's just one program instead. So you'll see actually on the revenue report that there's the Adult Literacy Grant Basic, and then under that is Adult Literacy Grant Families. And in previous years, it was back to 10-11, you'll see that there was the similar amount of money allocated to each of those as a separate program. And then as of 11-12, they put it into, well, actually 11-12, we didn't get anything. This year, they put it into one, and they said this is combined. We do still offer that services to those FFL people. And what that is any learner who has a child under the age of 5 would fall into that category, and then they give them, as you said, free books. They get a free book for their child once a month. They believe they mail it to their home.
So right now it's through the ALS, it's the Adult Literacy Services.
Correct.
So if you happen to be a parent, but there's no program specifically for the families at this point.
I can speak to that a little bit too.
Okay.
Again, last year when we had the cut in funds, they were scaling back on pieces of the program, and they did stop doing programming, where they actually used to have a monthly program, whether they would bring in a puppet show, or they would have an event, or they would have like a literacy kind of little carnival where they would draw in shaving cream and letters and whatever. We did stop that last year. It has not come back yet this year, but that is something that we are looking at. is how we can bring that back. The other issue with that is that we were having these programs which cost a lot of money in terms of staff time, resources, and then if they wanted to bring in performers, I mean, that's incidental more, it's the staff time and the planning. And they were not really getting very many people to come. And that was part of the reason why they thought that that was an area that they could cut.
Gotcha. I don't want to belabor this, but the programs, obviously I have a background in this. Worked with the state library. But the programs that we would help produce were once a week with parents who would get together, and they would, there would be books that would be handed out. They would talk to the parents about how to read with their kids and important things, and then actually have a story time where the kids would come in. It'd be really targeted. And obviously, it would also be for learners that had low literacy skills. So it was a really targeted once a week, and it went through a whole program of 3 months. And is that something that did happen, or is that something that?
It is, we have never, I've been here since 2005, and we have never had anything that structured. We did used to have a monthly, like once a month of story time, giving away lots of free books, you know, whatever they would have piles of them, and, you know, paperbacks, and modeling story, reading to your child, all that kind of stuff. But that was more of a once a month thing. We never did a structured once a week thing like that.
Well, it's something I think is important, so that's good,
ideas.
thank you. And another quick question. And I see we've listed some other programs in the county, and is there been any coordination with these programs?
There is, I believe there's regular coordination. Every time a person comes in or calls in, if, they will, what's the word, assess, I'm sorry, they will assess those people. If their learning needs don't fit in with the programs we offer, they refer them back and forth all the time.
Right.
We refer to them, they refer to us.
I saw a long email from Dan Jenkins, who's been active in the Adult Literacy League, that they've closed down, they're closing down the Adult Literacy League, and turning their resources over to the foundation.
Wow.
So that will probably put additional pressure on our program.
Well, that begs a question. My next question is, and I'm sorry, the literacy donations. And I see we have about $9,000. Is that part of the foundation, or is that something that comes directly to the library?
A lot of that money comes directly to the library and not through the foundation.
And is that
And from the Friends group.
and the Friends groups? Because
the
that
Santa
could be one of
Rosa-
those
only-
buckets that maybe
Only
we're
the
talking
Santa Rosa Friends group gives money regularly to the literacy program.
Okay, so that may be something we could work with the foundation on. Is that possible?
Another thing that
Well,
I think
it would have to be evaluated with all of the priorities that we depend on the foundation for.
Gotcha, okay.
I'm just going to respond to Sandy's comment about how only the Santa Rosa Friends group does currently regularly give money to the literacy program. I think, again, that's a piece of an education program that, because it's located here, many of the branches probably don't even think, oh, that also, I think that also serves my community. Some communities more than others, but I think if we could communicate that more regularly, that might be something that we could hit up at other friends groups for.
It's another bit of pressure on the library as the adult eds go away and these programs go away, like we've just seen with the literacy program that's going away. So I know that's all in the juggle, but I personally think it's really important for the library. So,
Are there any other commissioner comments, questions?
I just
on
have one
this?
more question.
Okay.
And maybe you said this, I apologize if I missed it. You said that the state money was reinstated for the 12-13 budget. What are we anticipating for the 13-14 budget?
I don't know.
Either the same level or the California Library Association Legislation Committee is actually proposing, trying to advocate for another $750,000 for the literacy programs. So there is an attempt, because it's so popular, to
So we're
increase the funding.
cautiously optimistic that the outside funding sources will stay the same.
Yes.
cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Any other comments from the commission? Comments from the public?
I just wanted to thank you very much for that report, and it's nice to have it annually, and I know last year there were some issues about the budget.
I think we forgot to include it in the packet, then we had to send it back the next
Right,
year, and then there
right,
were some discrepancies.
right.
Yeah, we fixed that.
Okay, and I've been told by both you and Sandy that, you're looking more closely at that program to make sure that it runs more smoothly, and how is that going?
One piece of it, I would say, is that I feel like I understand it a whole lot better than I probably did last year and the year before when I assisted with presenting the report. I think it's going well. We are looking at where the money is going, looking at how it's being allocated. We are working with the staff to improve their working with each other and that kind of stuff. So I think it's going well.
Okay, thanks very much, appreciate it.
Thank you. Comments from the public? Okay, by the way, do we have a time that we're going to break for lunch, or?
Rebecca, what time is lunch supposed to be here? It's here, so it's sort of in the flow of the meeting.
So should we break after this and have lunch, and
That's fine.
is that okay with the commission? Okay.
We're going to do this one next.
We do the last one on this
Yeah.
item and then, okay. All right. Library costs by, utility costs by branch.
This was a request that Julia made last time for this breakdown, so it's provided at her request.
Did I?
Yes.
I have a question about it, but we'll get on, is the 1213, is that 85,000 total for central? Those totals, are those to date or projected?
They're today.
So we can't really compare 11 and 12 till the end of 13?
No.
Okay.
Although, because it's been a colder winter, it does appear that we're running. I don't think they're projected. I think they're actuals.
Does Sebastopol just not have garbage, or they don't charge us for it?
100% recycled.
And for instance, I think we can assume that, I believe it's Cloverdale's water and sewage rates are going up substantially this next year, so we'll probably see an increase there.
Okay.
Look at Healdsburg's. Healdsburg's water runs substantially more, water and sewer runs substantially more because we're paying for the overhaul of the sewer system and the water plant or whatever.
So you don't know how far into 2013 this goes?
No, I can't tell you right off the top of my head. I'd have to ask the staff. I can ask at lunch.
Okay, because I was thinking we had been doing a really good job.
Right, that's what I asked.
And, because I know your staff has been working to do more streamlining to reduce costs.
Right, well, most of that had already been done before last year.
Does this reflect the closing on Sunday and Monday too, the reduction?
Well, the closing on Monday and the reduction of 1 night a week and 2 hours on Saturday.
And I don't want us to lose the sight of solar, is that? I mean, just, we were presented with issues about solar, and then I know there are problems stirring up, but we pay a lot of money in electricity.
I think the difficulty with solar, though, is you have to be very, very careful about figuring out what the payback is right now, because solar is not cheap to install. So how many years of lower electricity rates will it take to pay for the cost of solar installation?
There are programs, like I know the Petaluma schools have, where a company takes the responsibility of putting in the solar, and then they sell the electricity to the district at a lower rate. So there's some savings that way without the expense of putting in solar. That's my understanding of the situation.
I think
But you
Mr.
have to-
Popanuk's time has been focused elsewhere.
Okay, but I just personally don't want us to lose sight of safety.
You know, I think it's a very good thing. I've run into situations where people get all excited about it.
Right.
And then they say, wait a minute, this isn't the way it was supposed to happen. We have to be very careful about.
Right, and the other issue is we don't own the building, so
Right.
I
Right.
think.
See,
Yeah.
that's the major stumbling block.
Yeah.
too,
We don't
is
own
most
them,
of the
and
building.
So we have to
Most of
partner.
the.
I understand
yeah.
that. All I'm saying is I don't want it to fall off the
No.
table.
And the contracts you're talking about, because I've looked into them a little bit, usually require a long-term commitment on the part of the entity. 20-year minimum is what I've seen. So, part of that is then going to the city and saying what happens, figuring out what happens if you don't stay in the building, or if they want to move you, or if something happens like that.
Okay. Any other comments about this part of the report? It is now 12:30, almost 12:30. Should we include, just so we can move along, a half hour for lunch?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's reconvene at 1. All right.